Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. In this episode, I interview Michael H Shuman. Michael is an American economist, attorney, author, and entrepreneur, and a leading visionary on community economics. He's a senior researcher of local analytics, where he performed economic development analysis for states, local government, and businesses around North America. He's credited with being one of the architects of the 2012 Jobs Acts and dozens of state laws overhauling security regulations of crowdfunding. He has co-authored and edited 10 books. One of his books, The Small Mart Revolution, How Local Businesses Are Beating the Global Competition, received the Bronze Prize for Best Business Book of 2006. A prolific speaker, Michael has given an average of more than one invited talk per week, mostly to local governments and universities for the past 30 years in nearly every US state and more than a dozen countries. Hello, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you here. Last time we met was about 2 years ago, I think, for the Economics of Happiness conference.
Right, and now we're doing the shutdown of happiness, where we try to keep ourselves safe in the COVID world.
Right, and well, absolutely, totally safe at the moment, as we know. Michael, you're an attorney, an economist, a writer, and you've written many books on local economies, local dollars, local cents, the Small Mart Revolution, the local economy solution, and going local. And my first question to you is going to be, how do you define local? What's local and what's not?
Right, so in my view, local has three important components. One part is ownership, one part is proximity, and one part is control. Ownership, for me, is 51% or more of a company is owned by the people who live in close proximity of that company. And the reason why local ownership matters is that we have lots of evidence that locally owned companies tend to re-spend their money in business transactions with people living in the community, with other businesses in the community. So you get a higher so-called multiplier rate. And if, for example, you have a local business that for every dollar you put into it is spending 2 or 3 times as much locally as a non-local chain business, that's going to lead to a significant enhancement of local business, wealth, and jobs. The second way of thinking about local is just proximity. So when you think about farm to table, that you want that distance from the farm going to the processor, going to the store, going to the table to be as short as possible. And for some things that we're concerned about, like carbon footprint, having a very short distance, a short local distance where you're supplying things locally, that is extremely important. The last part of local is control, because you can have a business that is nominally locally owned, like a McDonald's franchise that is owned by someone in the community, and yet because all of the business procedures in that McDonald's are dictated from Hamburger University 10,000 miles away, the transactions that come out of that McDonald's are not going to be that beneficial for the community. So, the reason why you think about local in all of these ways is that it's complicated, right? And sometimes it's a neighborhood that we care about. Certainly if you have a small shopping district, the local transactions within the neighborhood are really important. But sometimes we're talking about, say, local investment. And local investment in the United States is partially defined by the federal government, partially defined by state government. So talking about states as the locus of local investment activity is important. Same thing in Australia, that you have both federal investment law and then state investment law. So if you're thinking about local investment in Australia, you really want to focus on the state level.
What are the advantages of refocusing the economy on a local level?
Well, there are many advantages. As I mentioned, one is that we know from about 24 studies that when you compare two businesses, one locally owned, one not, or two industries, one locally owned or not, the dollar that goes into the local business or industry generates 2 to 4 times the income, wealth, and jobs. And that also means more taxes, it means more charitable contributions. So it's a huge economic impact to have more and more of your economy locally owned. A second element is that if we think about, again, proximity, one of the goals of the local economy movement is to get your community to be more diversified and more self-reliant. And more self-reliance generates more resilience in the face of catastrophe. So I think what we're seeing now in the COVID-19 era is that communities that have stronger local food systems are more resilient in the face of these kinds of issues. And one of the fascinating things that we're seeing is that more and more people are actually joining up with community-supported agriculture and other forms of direct relationships with farmers because they're getting nervous about these long, non-local, non-proximate supply chains. So, we could go through a bunch of other reasons why local is so important. We know that local businesses are where entrepreneurship takes place, and entrepreneurship is what's going to create most of the jobs in your economy. We know that local businesses, say local restaurants or local retailers, one of a kind, is what draws outside tourists. So if you want a tourist economy, this is really important. We actually have evidence that locally owned businesses, say if you're looking at locally owned manufacturers that have a pollution component, that locally owned smokestack manufacturers tend to emit much less pollution than absentee-owned businesses.
Right.
And the reason is shame, right? Because if you're bumping into the people you're dumping smoke or other pollution on at church or at the school or at the supermarket, you're going to get a lot of blowback. Whereas if you're doing so in the name of some giant, uranium mine that's owned, again, 1,000 miles away, it ain't going to happen.
Never realized shame was so important.
Yes. There's an interesting sociology literature that says that local business communities have greater degrees of volunteership and less civil unrest. There is a political science literature that says that local business communities have higher rates of voter participation. So there's really an extremely long and interesting list of reasons why local business matter. And I think we're going to really see this as we come out of this COVID-19 epidemic, because really local businesses are also very fragile. And this epidemic is going to be killing millions of businesses, millions of local businesses across the world. In the United States, what we've seen is that packages that were designed to save or help local businesses have been largely cannibalized by larger corporations masquerading as local businesses. And so local businesses are kind of thrown out on their own, and it's going to be a really hard time for them to survive. And one of the things that I'm encouraging people I talk to think about is, you can't save all the local businesses that have been hurt by this pandemic, but maybe you can save one. And maybe you can approach one business and spend $500 or $1,000 as an advance purchase of stuff over the next year, and then you just work it down on a credit basis, so that these businesses, as they come out of this pandemic, have a good cash flow to resume business.
Right. I remember from your conference, you had those figures. If you invest in a local business, you'll see, 40 cents of that dollar back in the local economy. And if you invest in that type of business that much, and if you invest in multinational, you'll see nothing coming back into the local community.
Yeah, so as I said, there are a bunch of these different studies out there. I'll give you a recent one that was done in Seattle, looking at a food co-op called the Central Co-op. And what they studied was, where does the money move? And basically, this study showed that for every dollar that goes into the food co-op compared to a supermarket, twice as much money was going into the local economy. And what does that mean in concrete terms? If you removed that food co-op and replaced it with a conventional grocery store, Seattle would lose about 100 jobs. So it just shows that one institution can have an incredibly important effect on the overall health of your employment sector.
That's amazing. And I think you also in that conference insisted on small businesses over big ones.
Yes. So here's what's really quite remarkable is that despite our best efforts, and by our I mean governments and economic development agencies, despite our best efforts to kill local businesses by subsidizing big businesses and in other ways creating barriers or difficulties like we are with these recovery packages for small businesses, they've done pretty well. And, if you look at the typical spending patterns of an American or an Australian. So, I'm an old guy. I was born in the 1950s. When I was growing up, my family spent about 2/3 of its budget on goods. Lots of foodstuffs and what do we have? Like reel-to-reel tape recorders and old test tube televisions, that kind of stuff.
The good stuff.
Now, our families are spending about something like 3/4 of our money on services. Services being everything from childcare to getting your hair cut, to healthcare, to education, to financial services, which is how we get our house or how we get our cars. And the thing about services is that they are inherently competitive at the local level, that we need a close, trusting relationship in order to do the services. And it's one of the reasons why our economies are actually so vulnerable to this COVID epidemic, because so many of the service industries where there's close human contact have had to shut down or in some way diminish their activity because of social distance. So that's most of our economy right now, is service, and service, as I said, is very competitive at a small local scale. So what remains of the goods, if you look at the goods, what's interesting about that is that only about 1/4 of the goods that we now spend our money on are things like electronics that are produced on export platforms out of maquiladoras or out of Vietnam, in your case. And the thing about these goods is that they are pretty much high value and low weight, okay? And as long as you have something that doesn't weigh a lot, you can ship it over long distances without a lot of expense. So all of those things are going to continue to be produced globally. But that's 5% of what people are spending their money on. The other
Right.
3/4 of the goods are things like food, paper, building materials, what we call non-durable goods. And these goods have the characteristic of being heavy and relatively low value. Like food is mostly water, okay? And it doesn't make sense to ship water all around the world. It makes sense that really this is one of the most compelling reasons why economic reasons why local food movements have boomed everywhere around the planet, rich countries, poor countries, is because it makes more sense to localize our food supplies.
All right, let's dig into this because the usual belief is, well, whatever's produced by multinationals, etc., well, for me, the consumer will end up being cheaper for my wallet. I remember a local comedian here who did this comedy gig where she made fun of herself. There was no supermarket in this little town, and then they built a Woolworth, and she was part of the people who was like, no, I'll never go there. And then 3 years later, she stepped in there. And she was like, she looked at the price. She was like, "Fuck, it's so cheap." And so she was making fun of her own hypocrisy. But that's basically everyone. It's the fact that when you see producers and services that come out of a multinational, usually they bring the prices down, which is why we don't have very strong local economies, because as a consumer, you're attracted to low price. What would you say about that?
Well, I would say what the comedian is making fun of is not so much hypocrisy, it's just being practical. And none of us should torture ourselves with being perfect. And we shouldn't let perfect get in the way of the good. And changing just some of our purchasing habits, 5 or 10% of our purchasing habits from non-local to local can make an enormous difference in our economic well-being. And I would say, the biggest challenge that people have is getting information about local goods and services. And that's why it's been so important over the last 20 years that groups of local businesses come together. They create either a Main Street group or a downtown group or a local business alliance. And these groups, more so than the old-style chambers of commerce, these groups really help to advertise local goods and services, make people aware of those. And one thing we know about buy local campaigns is they work. That the more, and if you think about it, that's a non-trivial assertion, because if local goods and services were more expensive across the board than non-local goods and services, buy local campaigns would backfire, because once people were aware of all the bad deals and shoddy goods that the local stores and local service suppliers were providing, they would never touch them again. But in fact, what people discover is there's great stuff out there that I knew nothing about, because the local businesses don't have the bandwidth to do that kind of marketing. So part of our challenge is to raise awareness in our communities about what are great deals locally. Now, here's another thing, too, that I think people confuse when you're talking about local purchasing. I believe that no human being buys a good exclusively on price. And that's sort of a standard assumption in economics 101 models, that there's price and there's quantity of every good, and that's how you draw a demand curve and a supply curve and yada yada. That's economics. But the truth is, if consumers were buying things only on the basis of price, Starbucks coffee would never exist, because it's the most expensive cup of coffee in town. right?
I would say if it was based on quality as well.
Yeah, right.
would-
Yeah, well, so we can you know look behind the curtain and say, okay, what is it that Starbucks is giving to people? But the term that I would use is value. That somehow Starbucks has convinced people that their cup of coffee is a better value, even if people are spending more money. And frankly, that is the strategy that local businesses need to use as well. It's the better value in the service providers you know, love, and trust in your own community. It's the better value in the local food that you trust coming from farmers that's been unadulterated in certain ways. And so as we are building up these sort of local business sectors, we have to sort of help them along to communicate what is their real value to consumers, and therein is where the transition to greater and greater local purchasing will occur.
So I'm interested in that question. In those marketing campaigns that you have seen working for local businesses, what's the angle? What do consumers hook on and agree with that make them buy local?
Well, I think initially it is some of these studies we talked about the greater impact of a local dollar. And
By the way, those studies, are they produced by big names, like big institutions and universities?
so the best producer of many of these studies is a consulting firm called Civic Economics. They're based. They have two people who are based in. One's in Chicago, one's in Tulsa, but there's these studies have been done by a bunch of others. I've done a couple of these studies as well, and they all use really pretty basic economic models to show that when money is respent in a community, it has positive impacts. It's not really extraordinary information that you learn out of it. But at this point, I think these studies are almost so predictable and so dull that, they're not even necessary anymore.
I know what you mean because I went to a conference one time that was held by the director of economy of the university of the town I was living in France. And the title was, "What are the beliefs of the economists?" And he started with, the first belief of an economist is that he has no beliefs, is that it's all science. Then he went on showing us 3 pages of mathematics, really complicated, and told us, you know what that is? That is the calculation to know the effect on insurances of divorces that are the consequence of lifting up or down the toilet seat in the household.
Yes.
So I know what you mean by complicated or not complicated
Right.
economy studies.
Yes, but some, I continue to do some of these studies because I regard it as a form of, I don't know, like Japanese dancing, right? You have to do kabuki in order to convey a certain storyline. You know the kabuki is not realistic, but you go through the motions of data and analysis to show, okay, I can do this too, and now you will listen to me. But I want to go back a little bit and talk about the themes that compel people to buy local. I think, basically when people discover new local goods and services that they knew nothing about, they get kind of excited. And then they form a relationship. And really, at some fundamental level, what local economy building is all about is replacing what are opaque, distant, and untrustworthy relationships, anonymous relationships at a distance, and replacing them with personal relationships that have more trust and responsibility built into them. And those relationships are around workers and managers, They are around investors and the board. They are around customers and the business, or around suppliers and the business. So all of those relationships, if we can put real names on them and real people on them, people tend to say this is a cool thing to do. It's one of the reasons why people take such joy in going into farmers markets, because they are bundles of relationships.
Right, relationships and personalizing the relationship.
Yes.
That is nice. That is quite a good incentive, I realize. So that's how you make people buy local. I'd like now to maybe dig a bit in what you could say about the different local services. So I know that farming is a big one for local economy, but maybe we can talk as well about banking and local economy.
Yes. So the financial sector, I think, is a particularly important one to localize. And, and there are sort of things you can make fun of in the local economy movement. And one of the things that I make fun of is, people debating till they're blue in the face. Well, you bought this hammer from China at a local hardware store. You're really not being very pure. Or you bought this, you went to a supermarket and bought local food. And again, you're not being so pure. And look, these are $10, $20 transactions here and there. This is not what we should be wasting our time on, because where we put our investment money is so important. The single largest expenditure that people make in your country and mine is on housing. And housing is largely about a financial decision for many people. If you're going to do a mortgage in a home, and what is your relationship with a bank? I would say that we now have pretty good evidence that smaller banks really that have good relationships with their customers are going to provide cheaper loans, better service, lower overheads, more returns on your deposits than do larger banks. And you can see this in a lot of the larger co-ops that are in the co-op banks, credit unions that are in Australia. And even when I look at a bank like Bendigo, I think what makes Bendigo great are its many local satellites that has created in rural areas across Australia. But banking is only a small part of the picture. So in Australia, of course, all of you have to put 9%, give or take, of everything you earn into a superannuation fund. We have a slightly different way of doing it in the United States. These superannuation funds are then reinvested almost 100% in big businesses with publicly traded stocks and bonds. Now that's kind of crazy, because by far most of your economy, like 60-70% of your economy is in locally owned business, and yet they're getting none of your money from your superannuation funds. That is a mismatch of your capital and what we know makes an economy healthy. So a lot of what people are working on now is how do we recreate finance systems to make it cheaper and easier for all of us, whether through our superannuation funds or other kinds of investment we do. How can we put more of our money into local business? So I have a new book that comes out in about 30 days in the United States called Put Your Money Where Your Life Is. And I talk about all of the ways that you could take, what we call your tax-deferred pension money here and put it into yourself, your house, energy efficiency, paying off your kids' loans. You could put it into local businesses. You can put it into bonds that are issued by your city. You could put it into a local investment fund. You could put it into maybe there are some bonds that are trading out there from other communities that have local business that you want to support. There's lots and lots of options out there that are becoming real. And one thing that's happened is that just in very recent years, so for us, the year when investment crowdfunding was legalized was 2016. For you, I believe it was 2018. So we're just getting started at learning.
What do you mean by that? The year by which it was authorized?
Yeah. So I know the last time I was in Australia, which was, I guess it was a little more than a year ago, and Food Connect from Brisbane had just raised like $1.5 million for a building to house its CSA from crowdfunding, and it was one of the first success stories out there.
Wow. And so laws about equity and all that stuff came out, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, really, the reason why people are not investing in local business is that there are no options. And the reason why there are no options is that our securities law, our finance laws, just made it too damn expensive for local businesses to create loan notes or stock notes that were available for grassroots investors to invest in. So these crowdfunding reforms that we've done in both your country and mine, have fundamentally changed the rules of the road. The problem is that 99% of investors and businesses haven't heard the news yet. And I think we need to start changing that.
Yeah, talking about that. So, you were saying before there's not a lot of marketing for local businesses. There's not a lot of information. You don't know what's happening. Now you're talking about this, and people don't have that information either. What tools and platforms exist out there to help build local economies?
So they are emerging tools. I mean, I've been trying to develop a website close to where I live called the Maryland Neighborhood Exchange, where we are training businesses and training investors how to do crowdfunding before anything goes on to a formal internet portal where you can actually buy the securities. And one of the things that we've discovered is there's another set of rules, security rules, that says, sorry, you're not allowed to talk. If you're a person and this is a business, if that business has not formally issued a security offering, you're not allowed to talk about the possibility of investing. Now that to me is utterly ludicrous. It's a remnant of securities laws that were enacted in the 1930s when most of our communication was done by telegraph and staticky radio and heavy print, right? And we haven't really updated our securities laws around this. So in the United States, we are now trying to change the securities laws around communication. At the federal level, there's a rule change pending, and I'm trying to do this at my state level as well. So, I mean, I feel like all of us kind of have to go back to business school and understand what really makes up this financial system. What are these rules? And now is a really good time to change these rules, because what I've discovered is that whether you're conservative or a progressive, you cannot stand securities lawyers because they get in the way of such ridiculous things. So you can devise alliances between left and right to reform these investment laws. And that's what we did in the United States. I mean, we got supermajorities of Democrats and Republicans to work together for the first time ever in a given year to try to change these laws. And I feel like, we need to fundamentally rebuild a security system around local investment. It has to affect local investment funds. We have to create local stock exchanges. We have to make superannuation funds available for local reinvestment. So these are all different pieces of law that Australians need to work on.
Yeah, you and I were talking about a directory of local businesses needing support at some point.
Yes. So I think that, getting a directory of businesses, making that filling in the directory, like what are the expansion plans of all the businesses in here, and then inviting people to say, okay, yeah, think about them from a purchasing standpoint, but also think about them from an investment standpoint. Like who among these businesses has a plan for expansion that excites you? And by the way, it's worth saying, since we're talking about local investment, that almost always formal investment advisors will say, oh, you put your money into local business, you're going to lose it all because most local businesses fail. And what they've just made is a colossal mistake, because it's not true that most local businesses fail. Most local startups fail. In fact, all startups have a high failure rate. So a key thing that we need to teach people about local investing is, unless you're really risk, prone, focus on existing businesses that you have 10 years of a relationship with, the management, you love the good in the service, they're doing a modest expansion, and that's what you support.
Right. Versus startups. That's really exciting stuff. Maybe now, naturally, I'll come to the question of local currencies. Are they beneficial? Do they help? How much do they help? And what do they help with?
So earlier we talked about the concept of the economic multiplier. And because locally owned businesses spend more of their money locally, you get a higher multiplier effect. What local currency does is, because local currency is only really accepted by businesses that have a deep relationship with other businesses in the community, local currency by definition is going to have a higher multiplier effect than a conventional dollar. So I do think, you can see that local currency systems do tend to keep more money in the community and have an impact on income, wealth, and jobs. The problem with local currencies is that they tend to be very small. They tend to be a group of a couple of hundred people who are really committed to this, but it's in an economy of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, so it doesn't make that big a difference. Where you really do see local currencies making a bigger difference is where the local government actually pays its civil servants in the local currency and accepts partial payment of taxes in the local currency. The local government is the biggest anchor institution in the community. So once you get that anchor institution involved in the local currency, it's at a whole different level, and its ability to fundamentally influence the economy is significantly greater.
I see. I know you love that topic, but local currencies versus cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies, whether you like them or not, are coming in big time. And there's a lot of talk about them replacing fiat currencies as well. Let's see if that happens. But they're coming in big time, and there's so many of them, and there's so much talk about them. Will they help local economies thrive, or will they create obstacles to that?
Right. I am deeply skeptical of cryptocurrencies, and the reason is this. The reason why I like local, as we talked about, local economy, anything, whether it's purchasing suppliers, business development, investing, is again to have transparent, personal relationships so I understand what's happening. Now, I'm not a dumb guy, but I can't tell you how most cryptocurrencies operate. There are things embedded in cryptocurrencies that remind me of the kind of radioactive waste that was embedded in mortgage derivatives that brought down the real estate market in the United States in 2008. So I would say until and unless you really understand everything about the cryptocurrency that's presented to you, be very skeptical and stay away from it.
I see. I did an interview of a man called Santiago Siri a few weeks ago who built a system called Democracy Earth. So it's not, in those news, it's very technical, and it's more as your currency is for your vote than it is for buying stuff. But I had this conversation with him when he's 36 years old, and all the conferences he goes to, he's the oldest.
Right.
It's a really young generation that are building and using those cryptocurrencies and are of the opinion that that's going to be the good thing to change the world.
You know, I mean, I feel like we have many generations of people who ascribe magical powers to money, magical thinking about money. And there's an entire branch of economics at the University of Chicago that believes that money supply is everything that makes an economy good or bad. And what I see now is that lots of activists sometimes embrace money and they just assume, well, if we can just create this magical new currency, we will have an infinite supply of goods and services. And I always am kind of cross-eyed by the end of the conversation because I never know exactly what they're doing. And what I say to people with these kind of novel ideas about currency is say, good luck, have a great experiment for 5 years, and then bring me data about what happened. I've never seen any of these people 5 years later. So I have to say again, the cryptocurrencies are going to come and go. Bitcoin is still around, but I think its value has been as wobbly as the stock market. So be very careful.
I don't want to dig too deep in cryptos, but just to be the devil's advocate for just a second, I think I understand what people see in there. It's not so much the actual currency, but the fact that the way the system is built disrupt central financial organizations.
Right.
That's what's exciting about all these people.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, you can reduce the power of banks, but we all are capable of creating credit with one another. You don't need banks to do that. Sometimes there's a little bit too much focus on the fact that banks can create credit. We as people can create credit. We as businesses can create credit. So just do that locally.
What's the difference between protectionism and self-sufficiency?
Yes.
In speaking about locality.
So, in my mind, I actually sometimes call myself the last free trader out there. because I really believe in comparative advantage if the rules of the system are properly designed so that, trade can proceed in an equitable fashion. But what happens now is we have rules of the road in trade that favor big companies, disfavor local business. We have heavy subsidies that go into the big business. And so it's hard to just think about comparative advantage in the old-fashioned way. That said, I think that crude forms of protectionism, where a country throws up tariffs to keep out non-local goods and services, is probably a dumb idea. I think that and the different, and what I would say is there's a difference between smart localization and dumb localization. Dumb localization puts up barriers and says, damn it, we're going to keep this stuff out, we're going to keep people out, and we're going to just localize best we can. And usually things suddenly get very expensive, things get scarce, people are smuggling things in from outside anyway. Smart localization says, you know what? We're just going to use market tools to make local businesses more competitive. We're going to make local purchasers more aware and more excited about doing local purchasing. We're going to make local investors more aware of opportunities of putting their money into local business. So smart localization is based on the market, whereas dumb localization uses protectionism. And frankly, I would argue that one of the really embarrassing features of the global system right now is that while it uses the language of free trade, it's actually highly protectionist because it is protecting big multinationals at the expense of local business.
I see. What Helena was talking about with all the subsidies and tax breaks, etc. Yeah. That's really interesting. That actually everyone who preaches for local economy is treated as protectionist, whereas the world is already protectionist, but protecting big businesses.
Yeah, and that. So this is a longer conversations, but one of the things that I've done in a couple of my books is compare the internal trading system in the United States, which is a pretty healthy one, I must say, for interstate commerce, and comparing the rules of that system with the rules as defined by, say, the World Trade Organization. And there's no correspondence to them at all. To take one example, in the United States, you're allowed at a local level to enact all kinds of health and safety measures as long as they're non-discriminatory. That is, they affect local producers and non-local producers in exactly the same way. And the international level, that's not true at all. And consequently, we have these scientific boards that are going around and invalidating laws that nations are putting out there for health and safety. So we have a lot of rethinking and rebuilding to do to come to anything approaching a free trade system that's worthy of the name.
Right. It is. I'm not an economist. I can tell, though, it's complex.
Yes.
I can tell there's many layers in economical systems. To finish off this interview, I'd like to ask one or two questions on a bit of a different angle. I'm very interested in the topic of meaning and purpose in terms of building healthy communities. Have you seen that when economies become a bit more local, because it creates a bit more community, people find a bit more purpose, a bit more meaning for their business.
Yes.
Is that something?
I mean, it's not just that I see it, but we have some studies that sort of look at a bunch of, demographic and sociological impacts of two kinds of communities. Again, one, might be a community with one big manufacturer that's very dependent on outside imports, and another community might be one with a more diversified small business base. And we know that generally speaking, there's more stability in that small business community. And the stability has all kinds of virtuous things about people's psychological well-being. Crime rates are lower. People are more polite with one another. I mean, there's a greater sense of a civil society. So yeah, it makes a huge difference. I think, and again, it comes back down to this point that a local economy is built on relationships that you care about. And the existing economy has lots of relationships that are opaque and distant and untrustworthy. And the more we can personalize the economy, I think by definition, the more humane our society is going to be.
Thank you for that answer. That's great to know that, it's a visible impact on people's psychologies. And then to finish off, how would you use this incredible situation we're in at the moment, the COVID lockdown, etc., as an opportunity for empowering local economies?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's just an enormous amount of pain that we're seeing, and I don't want to in any way minimize that pain. The pain of death, illness, the pain of unemployment, the pain of businesses shutting down. I mean, all of that is real. But out of this, some good things can, I think, happen. I think communities are going to be much more mindful of building resilient, diversified economies that are better able to withstand these kinds of threats that we're going to see more and more of in the coming years. I think people who've lost money in conventional investment markets, stock markets, are going to rethink maybe putting more of that money into local business projects and people. I think that a lot of voting in the United States, which was really subject to incredible amounts of political manipulation and monkey business, we're going to see a lot more voting by mail. And that's going to be really good for democracy because more people are going to participate. I know that in Australia, people are financially incentivized to vote, so you've got a different and better system going with that. I think that some industries that we should have never had, like cruise liners, those will disappear, or maybe not disappear entirely, but I think people are going to think very differently about going on them. Lots of us are learning how to telework and learning how to work without commuting. I mean, in a typical year, I spend about 1/3 of my time on the road. Over the last 2 months, I've spent no time on the road. And I have to tell you, my lifestyle is better. I have been more productive. I have learned how, with all kinds of my business contacts and clients, and as we're doing in our conversation today, learned how to work with people over long distances with this new technology. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect substitute for personal contact, but I think if you wanted to learn a quick lesson on that, it was possible to bring down our carbon footprint without complete catastrophe coming to Western civilization. We are experiencing it. And we're also experiencing with less use of cars, cleaner air, less noisy cities. Some cities are saying, this is a good thing. Maybe we should just permanently convert some of our roads to walkways. So I think, there's a different kind of economy, a different kind of society that's coming out of this, and it's not half bad.
You were talking about people turning towards local communities for resilience.
Yes. I think personally, yes. I think that as we spend more time at home and less time in our cars, we get to know our neighbors better. We get to know our neighborhood businesses better. And as you do that, you establish relationships. And I feel like, that will enhance our personal resilience. So, all of us should be thinking about, not necessarily in a kind of mad survivalist way, a Mad Max way, where am I going to get all of my energy, all of my food, all of my shelter? Okay, it's not going to play out that way. But I think what we can do is, as a community, whatever your community is, whether it's a big city or a small rural place, we can do a lot of planning so that we have reserves of these things available when another crisis hits. And we should be thinking about, as we are doing our economic development planning, how do we create a more diversified economy? How do we diversify our skills? How do we prepare ourselves so that we come out better with the next unexpected disaster?
Thank you so much for this interview, Michael. My last question to you would be if you could take 30 seconds, 45 seconds to address yourself to our listeners and send a message that's dear to you, something that touches you related to your topic.
Well, so I would just say I love having ongoing conversations with people. I do some of this through my website, which is michaelhshuman.com. I do some of this in workshops, and I've been doing workshops over the last few years with a great Australian placemaker named Gilbert Rochecouste, and we're continuing to do these kinds of community building workshops. So if your community wants to do some deep work on placemaking and on rebuilding your economy, we are here, ready, willing, excited to work with you.
Thank you, Michael. This was Michael Shuman, everybody, releasing his next book, Put Your Money Where Your Life Is. I invite you to check it out on michaelhshuman.com.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
The Future Seeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the Future Seeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.